Hi, this is Brian Lehrer. You're listening to WNYC On Demand, podcasts, streaming, and MP3 downloads, available when you want to listen at wnyc.org and iTunes. Relegated to late-night radio and web forums, the debate over unexplained phenomenon in our skies has long been clouded by poor research, conspiracy theories, and even outright hoaxes. Well, we now have a serious journalistic book to turn to. Joining us today is Leslie Kean, an investigative journalist whose articles have appeared in major publications, including the Boston Globe, The Nation magazine, and the Baltimore Sun, among others. Her new book, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, attempts to cut to the core of the debate, providing first-hand accounts from military personnel and officially released government documentation of sightings. And to some degree, this has more to do with what's going on here on Earth than anything that may be going on in space. Leslie, welcome to WNYC.
It's great to be here, Brian. Thank you.
Kean. You say Kean or Kean?
It's actually pronounced Kean.
Okay, like the former governor.
Exactly.
Same spelling. So unidentified flying objects, as we like to call them, are a difficult topic to broach for a serious investigative journalist, as they are tainted by the stigma of being far outside of mainstream science. So what compelled you to begin researching UFO phenomena in the first place?
Well, it's a really good question because there is a very powerful stigma. Back in about 10 years ago, I was actually working at a public radio station in California in the Bay Area, and I received a report from a colleague in France, a report that had not yet been translated to English, but I got an advance copy of this report that had been, it was a research study by a bunch of generals, I mean, maybe 4 generals, an admiral, and other high-level officials in France into this UFO phenomenon. And they had looked at official data from around the world, spent 3 years looking into it, had written up a bunch of case reports and analysis, and come to the conclusion that for a small percentage of cases, which are the ones they studied, the best explanation they could come up with for this was what they called the extraterrestrial hypothesis. In other words, this is a valid, rational possibility that needs to be further studied. And I was just a journalist there, covering various stories, and this just seemed to me like a really important news story. So I did my piece for the Boston Globe and have pursued it ever since.
And it's pretty funny how people kind of divide up into camps. People for whom no amount of evidence will be enough to prove it, and those to whom no amount of evidence could disprove their belief in UFOs. Already on our Facebook page, we have Ben answering the question, UFOs real or not? He says, not real. I'll believe it when I witness a spaceship park over Manhattan and little gray men come down and get in line at the Shake Shack. But Stephanie on Facebook wrote, if the NSA is real, National Security Agency, with all their projects, then UFOs are real. So this is the public stance.
And there's so much polarity. You're absolutely right. There's such extreme positions that people take, from absolutely denying the possibility to assuming that they're all extraterrestrials and they've been visiting us for a long time. And we're trying to find the middle ground through that. What are the facts? What do we really know? What do we not know? And that's what this book is really doing. And
the heart of your book is a great number of interviews with former military personnel, including Air Force pilots, who genuinely believe that they have engaged unidentified flying objects in dogfights. Can you tell me perhaps the most credible of those stories?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 incidents in the book. And again, rather than interviews with them, what's really amazing here is that they have actually written the pieces themselves. So the reader gets to read their own personal story, their own account in their own words. One of these men is from Iran. I mean, it's a long story, but basically he was sent up when he was a pilot. He was a pilot sent up by a general to examine this huge triangular, brilliant object that was sitting over Tehran. And there was 2 planes that went up, and when they get too close, their equipment became disabled. Eventually, some smaller objects started heading for his aircraft, and he actually tried to shoot them down. But his missiles became disabled at the last minute. And this really isn't just his story, because there were other planes up there, there were other observers, there was radar, there was conversations with the ground during the whole thing, other people watching it. I mean, there's just so much documentation for these cases that there's no way you can dismiss them.
What's your best guess as to what that actually was?
I mean, I'm just going with what my sources tell me. I mean, the pilot who was up there engaging it, who wrote the piece in the book, he believes that they couldn't possibly have been from Earth and from what he observed. And most of the people say that, but they also say we don't, but we really don't know for sure. And, what they would like is for there to be more of an investigation, more work put into finding out.
And the people he was speaking to on the radio, et cetera, corroborate this story?
Absolutely. I mean, that's all part of the data package. You have the voice tapes, you have radar, you have other witnesses, and they're usually other military people that observe it. So it's all the cases in this book from which these people talk about are so well documented that they're not just somebody telling a story. And lots of times the governments actually write up documents themselves. In this particular case, actually, the Iranian case we were just talking about, the U.S. government filed a 3-page detailed secret report. They were there afterwards. They filed their own report about it. They were not certainly in any kind of denial about what actually happened.
We should mention that the intro or the foreword to your book is by former White House Chief of Staff John Podesta. So that's not exactly, some wacko from the paranormal world. Why did John Podesta get interested in your book?
Well, he's actually been supporting a Freedom of Information Act effort I've been involved with for many years, which involved a UFO case in Pennsylvania in 1965, and it was a long process. I ended up finally actually suing NASA over to get documents on this case. So he's somebody who's really interested in people's right to information and government openness and has been supportive all along. And he's curious about the UFO phenomenon, very curious about it. So I think he recognizes the seriousness of the issue and the power of the people that are involved in this project and was willing to endorse it. And I'm very grateful for that. We also have a governor from Arizona involved, too, former governor from Arizona.
Of course, Republicans have been saying since the 90s that John Podesta is an alien. So right. I don't know, but no.
We have a Republican in the book, too, though, actually quite conservative Republican, former Governor Fife Symington from Arizona. So,
listeners, anything on this? I don't know if we want everybody's alleged UFO sightings, but any reaction to Leslie Kean and her book UFOs? Generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. I mean, we're getting a lot of things like this. Joel from Briarcliff on our comments page. In 1983 or so, my wife and I were in our co-op courtyard in Westchester. We looked directly up into the night sky and saw lights in a triangular pattern moving silently from south to north. They glided slowly and were, as far as we could guess, quite low in altitude, 1,000 feet or so. Our local newspaper re-reported the incident about 8 months or so ago. No explanation was given.
Right. You hear these reports so often, and of course, lots of times there is an explanation, Brian, of 85% of sightings that people report can be explained. So, and obviously this one hasn't, but I mean, if we had enough data to examine all the sightings, most of them can be explained.
And you cover a series of events that took place in Belgium in the late 80s where a craft was spotted 143 times. Now, based on the general description, which was a black triangular craft with a raised cockpit on top, can't we just assume this was a test flight of a stealth bomber or a similar experimental military craft?
Well, that was actually what people did assume at the time, because what else could it possibly have been? So you had the highest level officials actually went to the United States highest level officials to find out, and they were told no, it wasn't. It was not, a U.S. stealth bomber. It was not any kind of secret aircraft. And, they spent so much time looking into it. It's not like these people wouldn't be capable of finding that out if that's indeed what it was.
How much are you trying to document evidence for alien life? How much are you trying to document possible national security threats from elsewhere on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, it's really not about documenting alien life, because what we're really documenting here are physical objects that are in the sky that behave incredibly, that maneuver in ways that we can't explain through our current knowledge of physics, accelerate in a blink of an eye, things like that. But we're not talking about alien life. We do see these physical things. They actually sometimes land on the ground and leave marks, but we don't know what's in them, where they come from, why they're here, whether they're alien life related or not. And, so we can't really talk about that. We can only talk about what we see and what the evidence tells us.
Your book is illustrated with a series of color images, but they all predate the prevalence of accessible digital photography. Wouldn't it seem that with easy access to cameras now, in every telephone and everything else, UFO photographs would be of higher quality and greater frequency?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is they're of too much greater frequency because so many people are out there with their cameras. And there's also Photoshop, Brian. I mean, there's digital equipment, but there's really highly technological ways of faking photographs. So the internet is overloaded with UFO photographs, and I'm sure a lot of them they're mysterious things that people can take pictures of. But until the pictures are analyzed and we have a lot of data about a particular sighting, it doesn't really tell us very much, except that there's something curious there.
Barbara in New Paltz, you're an astronomer?
No, I'm not. I'm going to talk really fast because I might be interrupted very shortly. I listen to a science show on WAMC, my local public radio station, and there's a frequent guest named Bob Berman. He also writes for Discover magazine. And his feeling about UFOs is, why can't they leave something behind? They never leave a trace that can be analyzed or looked at. And I think he once said, why can't they just leave a gum wrapper and then maybe it can be taken seriously?
Thank you. That's a great question. Any gum wrappers out there?
No gum wrappers, but they actually do leave marks behind. I mean, for him to say they've never left any physical marks behind or anything behind, that just isn't accurate. There are cases, and there is documented in my book, of actual UFOs landing in the ground, leaving holes in the ground, breaking branches off trees, leaving radiation that can be detected by machines. So there's lots of physical effects that these things make on the ground or whatever, but why they don't leave something else behind, there's no way that any of us can ever answer that question.
John in Westchester, you're on WNYC. Hi, John.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask your guest, who was very interesting, if she had ever heard the story about Richard Nixon showing Jackie Gleason photographs of a dead alien that the government had after a game of golf they played together. That was a story I'd heard years ago, and I was wondering if she had ever heard that story. Jackie?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the story just like you have. I read it on the Internet. That's all I can say about it. I don't know anything more about it. But it's a story.
You can't confirm that Nixon actually did that.
Sorry, I can't do that.
James in Brooklyn, you get our last 10 seconds. You want them?
Right.
Go.
The King Tut is the proof of aliens. His body conformation, especially the skull, chest, and waist, are not human.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I'll have to check that one out sometime.
That's what you're dealing with out there. Leslie Kean, investigative reporter with a forward by John Podesta, has written UFOs. Generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to WNYC On Demand. Please check out our other programs at wnyc.org or on iTunes. This free service is made possible by our listeners. Become a member of WNYC today.